In April 2023, ABC News surveyed 250 First Nations residents in a New South Wales town of 1,824 people. 44% said they were worried about getting safe drinking water. They had reason to be. The sodium in their bore water had been sitting above Australian drinking water guidelines for more than 5 years. I know that sounds insane. It's not. There are 10 towns in this country where the local supply was officially, documentably, not safe to drink. And most Australians have never heard of a single one of them. This isn't internet rumour. Every town in this video has a named, dated citation. ABC News investigations, State Health Department announcements, council notices with the words "Do not drink" printed at the top. These aren't ancient history. Some of these alerts ran for over a decade. Some are still in litigation as of 2026. The pattern isn't one bad town with one bad pipe. It's a structural fault line running through rural and remote Australia, from Tasmania to the Northern Territory. And the people living on top of it are the ones who never made the evening news until the situation became impossible to ignore. Here's a phrase that should not exist in a wealthy country in the 21st century. Water insecurity worse than Bangladesh. That's not a community group's hyperbole. That's the framing ABC News used to describe what was happening in Walgett, New South Wales, a town of 1,824 people, sitting roughly 2.5 hours from the regional centre of Dubbo, in the flat western plains where the Namoi and Barwon rivers meet. Walgett's water problem wasn't a sudden pipe failure. It wasn't a short boil water notice that got resolved in a few days. It was a slow, grinding, years-long degradation of supply that the town's majority First Nations population had to live inside, while the rest of the country got on with its life. The source of the problem? Sodium. Specifically, bore water with sodium levels that exceeded Australian drinking water guidelines. Not for a season, not for a quarter, but for more than 5 consecutive years. Think about what 5 years of salty bore water means at the household level. Every time you turned on the tap, the water coming out was technically not within the guideline parameters that the Australian government has set for safe drinking. You could use it for some things. You couldn't drink it without concern. And if you were elderly, had kidney disease, had high blood pressure, were pregnant, or were raising small children, those concerns weren't theoretical. Sodium above guideline values carries real documented health implications for vulnerable populations. In Walgett, where socioeconomic disadvantage is already layered and deep, those vulnerable populations were not a small fraction. They were the community. In April 2023, ABC News published the results of a survey conducted among 250 First Nations residents in Walgett. The number that came out of that survey was this. 44% of respondents said they were worried about getting safe drinking water. That's almost half of surveyed residents. In a town that is supposed to be connected to a water supply, in a state that has a functioning water authority, in a country that ranks among the highest on the Human Development Index. 44% worried about water in New South Wales. The irony, or the insult, depending on how you look at it, is that Walgett isn't isolated by distance alone. It's not some impossible frontier. It sits between 2 river systems. The Namoi River runs nearby, and that's exactly what makes the 5-year timeline so difficult to explain away. The source that ultimately fixed the problem, the Namoi River, was there the whole time. What wasn't there, apparently, was the infrastructure, the urgency, or the political will to connect the town to it. On 4th May 2023, ABC News reported that Walgett would again be supplied from the Namoi River, marking the end of the salty bore water era. That's the good news. The complicated news is that it took more than 5 years of documented guideline exceedance, a national news investigation framing the situation as comparable to developing world water insecurity, and a community survey of 250 people to get that outcome. The residents of Walgett didn't get clean water because the system caught the problem early. They got it because they couldn't be ignored anymore. The landscape around Walgett is wide, flat, and ancient. The kind of country where the sky takes up more of your field of vision than the land does. Mulga scrub, red-brown soil, the shimmer of heat in summer that makes the horizon look liquid. It's a landscape built around water, around the rhythm of river systems and seasonal flooding, and yet the town at its centre spent 5 years drinking from a bore that exceeded safe sodium limits. Ask any local who lived through those years, and they'll tell you the same thing. The water tasted wrong, felt wrong, and there was nothing they could do about it. Walgett is the entry point for this list precisely because it represents the template: a regional town, a First Nations majority community, a water source that failed guideline standards, years of documented inadequacy, and a resolution that arrived not because the system worked, but because enough pressure built up that inaction became politically untenable. That template, you'll find, repeats itself with variations across this entire country. The contaminants change, the remoteness varies, but the structure stays the same. Uralla sits in the New England tablelands of northern New South Wales. Green country, cooler than the plains, with an elevation that gives it a temperament more like the highlands than the outback. The town has a population of around 2,728. It has a heritage main street, a history tied to bushranging legends, and, as of 18th December 2019, a do not drink notice on its water supply. The contaminant wasn't sodium, it wasn't nitrates, it was arsenic. Arsenic in the town water supply, measured at levels that exceeded Australian drinking water guideline values. Uralla Shire Council issued the formal "Do Not Drink" alert that December, and the language they used in the official notice was precise and unambiguous. Do not drink the water. Do not cook with it. And this is the part that separates this from a standard boil water alert. Boiling the water will not make it safe. That last clause matters enormously. When most people hear there's a problem with their tap water, their instinct is to boil it. Boiling kills bacteria. Boiling addresses biological contamination. But arsenic is a heavy metal. You cannot boil arsenic out of water. What you actually do when you boil water containing arsenic is reduce the water volume through evaporation, while the arsenic stays in the pot, which means the arsenic concentration in what remains goes up, not down. Boiling makes it worse. The council knew this, and they said it explicitly. That's not a council burying information, that's a council telling residents in plain language that the reflex response to a water notice would make their situation more dangerous, not less. The alert lasted 131 days. From 18th December 2019 to 27th April 2020, through the height of an Australian summer, through the first months of a global pandemic, through a period when supply chains for bottled water were under stress and people's attention was being pulled in 17 directions at once. For 131 days, residents of Uralla could not drink from their town supply, could not cook pasta or soup or rice with tap water, could not make tea or coffee without sourcing water from somewhere else. The alert was lifted on 27th April 2020, after arsenic levels fell back below guideline values. The council confirmed this. The system, in the technical sense, worked. The alert was issued, the alert was lifted when the problem resolved. But the question that sits behind the timeline is the one that's harder to answer. How does arsenic get into a New England town's water supply in the first place? The geology of the New England tablelands includes ancient mineralized zones. Arsenic occurs naturally in certain rock formations, and when groundwater or surface water moves through those zones, it can pick up the metal. This isn't always preventable, but it is detectable, and the 131-day timeline suggests the detection came at the point of a measurement that caught elevated levels after they'd already been building. 2,728 people. A cooler climate regional town with a functioning council in one of the wealthier Australian states. Not a remote community, not an isolated outpost with no road access. And yet arsenic above guideline levels came out of their taps for the better part of 5 months. The council handled the communication with more transparency than many. The residents still spent 131 days without safe tap water. Both things are true simultaneously, and the tension between them is exactly what defines this list. 2 towns, 2 different contaminants, 2 different kinds of documented failure. But here's what neither of those towns had: an entire community that couldn't drive to the next town for bottled water. The next place on this list has 192 residents and sits 250 kilometres from the nearest regional centre. When the tap water went undrinkable, It stayed that way for 7 months. And the colour of the water coming out? That's the detail that nobody who lived through it will let you forget. Greenvale, Queensland. Population 192 people. Distance to Townsville, the nearest major centre, approximately 250 kilometres of North Queensland Highway. This is the kind of town that doesn't appear on most Australians' mental maps, small enough to blink past on a road atlas, remote enough that supply problems can't be solved by driving 40 minutes to the next suburb supermarket. And in the first half of 2023, Greenvale had a water problem, a serious, documented 7-month water problem. On 1st of July 2023, ABC News published a report on Greenvale with the headline, "Greenvale's frustrations reach boiling point as tap water remains undrinkable." The specific detail the report documented, the one that captures the reality of the situation better than any graph, was this. The water coming from the taps was discoloured. Not slightly off. Discoloured. Residents weren't dealing with a water supply that looked fine but tested poorly behind the scenes. They were dealing with water that looked wrong when it came out of the pipe. For 7 consecutive months. Think about what 7 months means in a community of 192 people. There are no alternatives except what you can source externally. Bottled water, water trucked in, whatever you can get your hands on. For a town of 192, that external supply chain is not cheap, not reliable, and not something you can sustain indefinitely without cost. The discoloration was the visible sign of a supply that had broken down, and the fact that it persisted for 7 months without resolution tells you something concrete about the pace at which remote Queensland water infrastructure gets fixed. Greenvale sits in the Etheridge Shire, in a part of far north Queensland where the landscape shifts between open savanna, dry woodland, and the kind of country that turns dramatically in the wet season when the monsoon arrives. The town exists as a service point for surrounding cattle and agricultural operations. It has a pub, a caravan park, basic amenities, the typical skeleton of a small outback Queensland community. It does not have a population large enough to generate the kind of political pressure that forces rapid infrastructure responses. 192 people can make noise, but they are not a constituency that moves the dial quickly. The community frustration that ABC News documented in July 2023 wasn't about a council failing to communicate. It was about a fundamental, practical failure. 7 months of water coming out of the pipe in a state that suggested it should not be put in a human mouth. Locals who lived through that period described the situation not as an inconvenience, but as a basic dignity issue. When the water that comes out of your home tap is visibly wrong, something at the core of what a town is supposed to provide has broken down. And in Greenvale, that breakdown ran for 7 months before it reached enough public visibility to generate a national news report. There's a dimension to remote water failures that urban experience doesn't prepare you for. In a city, a pipe bursts and water gets trucked to the street within hours. There are backup systems, alternative connections, redundant infrastructure. In Greenvale, the alternative is 250 kilometres of highway. That's not a backup system, that's a logistical ordeal. Every litre of clean water that a Greenvale resident drank during those 7 months that didn't come from their tap had to either be purchased, driven in, or sourced from somewhere that involved planning and cost. For a community of 192, many of whom are not on high incomes, that cost was not trivial. It was not briefly inconvenient. It was a sustained financial and practical burden running the length of most of an Australian year. Palm Island is not a town you can drive away from. That's the single most important piece of geographical context for everything that follows. Great Palm Island sits off the coast of Queensland, north of Townsville, accessible only by ferry or small aircraft. When the water goes bad on Palm Island, you cannot put your family in the car and drive to the nearest town with a functioning supply. The island is the supply. The island is the only option. And in May 2019, that supply was, according to the mayor, not safe to drink. On 5th May 2019, ABC News published a report headlined, "Frustrated Mayor Calls for Help Over Undrinkable Palm Island Water." The key word in that headline is mayor. This wasn't a community group raising concerns. This wasn't a resident posting on social media. The elected head of the Palm Island Aboriginal Shire Council went to the national broadcaster and publicly stated that the town's water was undrinkable and that outside help was needed. When a mayor frames a water situation as requiring external intervention, the situation is past the point of routine maintenance. Palm Island has a population of around 2,445 people, and the vast majority of residents are Aboriginal Australians. The island has a complex and painful history. It was used as an Aboriginal reserve from 1918. People were forcibly relocated there from across Queensland, and it carries the weight of that history in its community fabric. The water crisis of 2019 landed on top of that history. When the mayor said residents couldn't drink the tap water, it wasn't the first time Palm Island had been failed by the systems meant to serve it. The isolation factor cannot be overstated. In Walgett, residents could, theoretically, at significant cost and effort, source bottled water from Dubbo or neighbouring towns. In Greenvale, those 250 kilometres to Townsville at least remain drivable. Palm Island sits in the Coral Sea. The ferry is the connection to the mainland, and it doesn't run continuously. For the 2,445 people living on Great Palm Island, a failing water supply isn't an infrastructure problem with logistical workarounds. It is a closed system crisis. Whatever solution exists has to either come by boat or be found on the island itself. The mayor's public appeal in 2019, going to mainstream press to call for help, is the kind of action that happens after internal channels have failed to produce results. You don't call ABC News as your first move. You call your state government representatives. You write letters to the relevant authority. You follow the process. The fact that the mayor ended up in front of a camera publicly describing the tap water as undrinkable and asking for help means that whatever preceded that moment, whatever quiet conversations, official requests, or formal complaints came before, had not produced an adequate response. What the residents of Palm Island were living with during that period was the specific psychological weight that comes with water insecurity on an island. Not knowing whether the water is safe, not being able to verify independently what's in it, not being able to simply opt out of the supply by driving to a neighbouring suburb. The tap is there, the water comes out, but the mayor is telling you not to drink it. That is a particular kind of helplessness that people in mainland Australian cities have no reference point for. And in 2019, it was the documented reality for an Aboriginal community that had been asking to be treated as full citizens for generations. Every town so far shares one characteristic. The failure happened within a connected system, a pipe, a bore, a treatment process that broke or was never adequate. But the next community had something different. An average reading, a maximum, both above the national guideline for protecting infants. The average alone was 75 milligrams per litre. The guideline is 50. And when the bottled water was trucked in, it didn't reach everyone. Someone got left out. Nitrate is the contaminant that gets less attention than it deserves, because it's harder to visualise than discoloration, harder to taste than sodium, and less cinematically alarming than arsenic or uranium. But nitrate above guideline levels in drinking water carries a documented and serious risk, specifically for infants under 6 months old, where it can cause methemoglobinemia, sometimes called blue baby syndrome, a condition that interferes with the blood's ability to carry oxygen. The Australian drinking water guideline for nitrate is 50 milligrams per litre. Yalgoo, Western Australia, was not at 50. It was not close to 50. ABC News reported in September 2016 that Yalgoo's drinking water had an average nitrate level of 75 milligrams per litre. The maximum reading recorded was 84 milligrams per litre. That maximum is 68% above the Australian guideline. For a community of 313 people, according to the 2021 ABS figures, sitting in the Midwest region of Western Australia, that's not a margin of error. That's a supply that had moved well into territory the Australian government's own standards had defined as unsafe for the most vulnerable members of the population. Yalgoo is a small Gold Rush-era town roughly 500 kilometres north of Perth, positioned in that part of the Midwest where red dust, mulga, and sparse pastoral country define the landscape as far as you can see in any direction. Its history is tied to the gold rush of the 1890s that briefly made it a regional centre of some consequence. By 2026, it has 313 residents, a pub that's been operating in some form since the colonial period, and a documented water quality failure that ABC News connected directly to a broader regional pattern of inadequate supply across Midwest communities. The response to the nitrate problem involved trucking bottled water into affected communities. This is not a trivial logistical operation. Midwest Western Australia is a long way from Perth's distribution networks, and the cost and coordination required to run bottled water at scale to small communities is significant. But here's the detail ABC News reported on 22 September 2016 that you need to hold in your head. Not all affected Midwest communities were receiving government-supplied bottled water. Some were, some weren't. The criterion for who qualified for the supply and who didn't was not publicly clear. What was clear was that nitrate levels in some communities remained above guideline, and the bottled water solution did not reach everyone. For a town of 313 people, the practical reality of living with above guideline nitrate in the water supply means making constant decisions about what the water is used for. Adults may face lower acute risk from nitrate than infants, but the broader concern about long-term exposure and the psychological burden of knowing your water doesn't meet national standards sits on the community continuously. Locals in Yalgoo during this period were not dealing with an abstract statistic. They were making decisions. Do I give this water to my baby? Do I use this for cooking? Is the bottled supply going to last? On a daily basis, while those questions should never have needed to be asked. Yalgoo stands as the entry point for the Western Australian section of this list, precisely because its data is so concrete. A reading of 84 milligrams per litre against a guideline of 50 milligrams per litre is not an ambiguous measurement. It's not a borderline case. It's a clear exceedance, documented by ABC News in a report that placed Yalgoo within a regional pattern of Midwest water quality failures, meaning this wasn't an isolated incident unique to one town's infrastructure. It was a systemic problem affecting multiple small communities in a part of Australia that is too remote and too underpopulated to generate the same urgency that equivalent failures in suburban Perth would produce instantly. On 30th of November 2021, the Western Australian government issued a media statement with a headline that sounds like good news. $3.4 million water treatment plant begins operation in Warburton. And in one sense, it is good news. A community finally has reliable potable water. But read the statement carefully, and the good news is inseparable from what it reveals. That before this plant began operation, the community of Warburton did not have a reliable source of potable water. The treatment plant didn't add a premium to an already adequate supply. It created the baseline. It made drinkable water available for the first time as a reliable, ongoing reality. Warburton sits in the Nanyajara lands, one of the most remote inhabited regions on the Australian continent. The Nanyajara lands span an area larger than many European countries, a vast stretch of Western Australian desert country northeast of Kalgoorlie. Warburton itself sits at a distance from the nearest substantial regional centre that makes ordinary infrastructure logistics look completely different from anything urban Australians would recognise. The community is predominantly Nanyajara people, an Aboriginal community with deep connection to country that long predates the town's current form. The population, according to 2021 ABS data, is 511 people. The government committed 3.4 million Australians to install the water treatment plant. If you do the division, and it's worth doing, that comes to approximately $6,654 per resident in infrastructure cost just to provide the baseline that every Australian is theoretically entitled to: safe, drinkable tap water. That number should sit uncomfortably, not because the investment was wrong, it was clearly necessary and long overdue, but because the fact that 511 people had to wait for a $3.4 million government commitment before they could reliably drink their own tap water tells you something about the hierarchy of infrastructure priority in this country. The Nanyajara lands present real logistical challenges. Distance, terrain, climate extremes, and the scale of the region all combine to make infrastructure expensive and complex in ways that have no direct equivalent in populated coastal Australia. None of that is in dispute. But complexity and cost explain the challenge. They don't excuse a timeline that left the community of over 500 people without reliable potable water until a treatment plant was commissioned in late 2021. The WA government's own media statement uses the phrase reliable source of potable water in the future tense, referring to what the plant would now provide. That future tense is the admission. Ask the people who have lived in Warburton across the years before the plant arrived, and the picture they describe is one of improvised solutions. Boiling water that may or may not have addressed the specific contaminants present, and the daily friction of living in a place where the tap water's safety was not something you could take for granted. The landscape around Warburton is severe. Red desert, ancient rock formations, skies of a depth and clarity that coastal Australians rarely encounter. It's the kind of country that commands respect. The community that lives within it commanded rather less than that from the infrastructure planning processes that left them without reliable potable water for so long, decades. That's not a vague estimate. That's the word ABC News used in August 2023 when reporting that Oodnadatta had finally gained access to clean drinking water. Decades. Not years, not a prolonged period. Decades of campaigning by residents of a 102-person community in South Australia's far north for water that other Australians have been able to access by turning on a tap their entire lives. Oodnadatta sits on the edge of the Simpson Desert in the far north of South Australia, country that is ancient, flat, and uncompromisingly hot for most of the year. The town was once the terminus of the Garn Railway before the line closed in 1980, and since then it has existed as one of the most isolated communities in the state. The Pink Roadhouse is its most identifiable landmark. Its population of 102 people, according to ABS 2021 data, makes it one of the smallest permanent communities in Australia. And for decades, those 102 people were drinking water that was not safe. SA Water's project documentation describes Oodnadatta as one of 3 remote South Australian towns whose existing non-drinking water supplies were upgraded to safe, clean drinking water through a desalination program. The language is important. Non-drinking water supplies. The water that came out of Oodnadatta's pipes before the desalination plant arrived wasn't an adequate supply, with occasional quality issues. It was, categorically, a non-drinking water supply. Residents had water in their pipes. They could not drink it. The 2023 ABC News report, headlined "Something in the Water," frames the desalination upgrade not as a routine infrastructure project, but as the resolution of a decades-long campaign. Residents of Oodnadatta had been asking, pushing, petitioning, and waiting for clean drinking water for a period measured not in years, but in generations of community advocacy. When the plant finally arrived and the water came through clean, ABC described it as the end of that campaign, which means the campaign existed, which means it was necessary, which means, for decades, it hadn't produced results. The honesty required here is that the logistics of providing potable water to a community of 102 people on the edge of the Simpson Desert are objectively complex and unavoidably expensive. The groundwater in the region is known to carry problematic mineral content. Desalination of bore water is technically demanding and operationally costly at small scale. These are real constraints, not pretexts, but they existed for decades while Oodnadatta's residents drank from a supply that SA Water's own classification called non-drinking water. The complexity explains the difficulty. It does not explain the decades. There is something almost philosophically jarring about Oodnadatta's situation. This is a community on the edge of one of the world's great deserts, in country where water has always been the organising principle of survival, where Aboriginal Australians navigated and lived across this landscape for thousands of years, developing deep knowledge of where water could be found and how to use it. And then, in the era of modern infrastructure, the town sat on a non-drinking water supply for decades, while the system worked out whether 102 people were worth the cost of a fix. If Oodnadatta represents the weight of decades of campaigning, Marla represents the extreme end of the scale question. How small does a community have to be before the economics of safe water infrastructure simply stop being considered? Marla, South Australia, has 38 residents. 38 people. That's a number small enough to fit in most Australian classrooms. and until SA Water completed a desalination upgrade in 2024, those 38 people were served by what SA Water explicitly classifies as a non-drinking water supply. SA Water's project documentation, published on its Water Talks page as of April 2025, identifies Marla alongside Oodnadatta and Marla as one of 3 remote South Australian communities whose non-drinking water supplies were upgraded through the desalination program. For Marla, the upgrade was completed in 2024. That means that until 2024, the pipe infrastructure in Marla carried water that its own water authority classified as non-drinking. Not inadequate, not borderline, non-drinking. Marla sits on the Stuart Highway in South Australia's far north, a fuel stop and rest point for travellers heading toward the Northern Territory border. It has a roadhouse, basic accommodation, and a small permanent residential population. The surrounding country is flat and ancient, marked by the hard light of the outback interior and the silence of a landscape where human presence is thin. It's the kind of place that long-haul drivers and adventurers pass through, refuel, and continue. For 38 people, it's home. And until last year, home came with tap water that wasn't safe to drink. The economic reality of Marla is worth confronting directly. Providing safe drinking water to 38 people through a desalination system is not a commercially rational proposition in any private market framework. The per-head infrastructure cost would be extreme. The ongoing operational cost of maintaining a desalination plant for a community of this size, in this location, cannot be recovered from the water bills of 36 residents. SA Water made this investment anyway, as a policy choice. That is not a small thing. It represents an explicit decision that 38 Australians in the far north of South Australia are entitled to the same baseline as 38 Australians in suburban Adelaide. But here's the other side of that ledger. For the years and decades before 2024, that policy choice had not been made. Those 38 people, or whatever number lived in Marla in earlier years, had non-drinking water coming out of their pipes and no desalination plant to change that. The investment of 2024 is the evidence that the previous situation was inadequate. SA Water building the plant is the confirmation that not building it was the failure. You cannot simultaneously commission a non-drinking to drinking upgrade and argue that the previous situation was acceptable. Marla represents the floor of this list in terms of population. 38 is the smallest community covered here. It is also, arguably, the community whose situation most directly exposes the gap between the theoretical universality of Australian infrastructure entitlement and the practical reality of how that entitlement gets delivered or withheld based on the number of people who happen to live in a given place. 38 people should not be a threshold question for safe water. In Marla, until 2024, it effectively was. 8 towns, 8 documented failures. But everything so far involves contamination, discoloration, guideline exceedances, infrastructure delays. The next town involves lead, not a bureaucratic threshold, lead in the water, confirmed enough that the Water Authority spent over 16,000 Australians in a single year buying bottled water rather than fixing the source. 79 residents, a decade of temporary fixes. And then there's the last town, where the contaminant is radioactive. Pioneer, Tasmania, population 79 people. 79. In a state that regularly promotes its clean, green environment and world-class wilderness credentials, a community of 79 residents spent the better part of a decade dealing with lead-contaminated drinking water, living off bottled water, and waiting for a piped supply that didn't arrive until 2022. This is Tasmania. These dates are from 2020 and 2022. ABC News reported in July 2020 that investigations into lead contaminating Pioneer's drinking water were ongoing. The report documented something that makes the situation concrete in a way that statistics sometimes don't. Some Pioneer residents were living off bottled water because they couldn't drink the tap water. Not occasionally buying bottled water as a preference, living off it, structurally dependent on delivered water because the tap water in their home was not safe to drink. Taswater, the state water utility, was paying for that bottled water. Specifically, ABC News reported that Taswater spent more than $16,000 on bottled water for some pioneer residents in a single financial year. 16,000 Australian dollars. That figure is worth holding for a moment. It represents the cost, in 1 year alone, of compensating for a structural failure without fixing the structure. The Water Authority was spending money, significant money, to paper over a lead contamination problem rather than resolve it. And the resolve wasn't delivered until 2022, meaning that annual bottled water expenditure was a repeating cost across a decade of temporary fixes. Lead contamination in drinking water is a specific, serious, and well-documented public health concern. Unlike nitrate, which carries primary concern for infants, lead exposure is dangerous across the population. Lead accumulates in the body over time. In children, lead exposure is associated with developmental and neurological impacts. In adults, it carries cardiovascular and kidney implications. There is no safe level of lead exposure that has been established by health authorities. The guideline for lead in Australian drinking water exists as a maximum above which action is required, but below which the goal is still to minimise exposure. For pioneer residents using tap water over a decade of lead contamination, minimisation wasn't the operating reality. Pioneer sits in northeastern Tasmania, in agricultural country south of the Bass Strait coast. The surrounding landscape is quietly beautiful in the Tasmanian way. Rolling hills, a cooler, damper climate than mainland Australia, green paddocks and dense native forest in the gullies. It's the kind of small Tasmanian community that has existed in its current form for generations, tied to farming and the rhythms of a rural economy. 79 people who have every reason to expect that their tap water is safe because they live in a developed country with a functioning water authority. In Pioneer, that expectation was wrong for a decade. In November 2022, ABC News reported that Pioneer was finally getting a piped water supply, described explicitly as coming after a decade of temporary fixes. That phrase, a decade of temporary fixes, is the institutional admission. Taswater's own communications, filtered through ABC News, acknowledged that what had existed before the pipe supply was a series of stopgap measures, none of which had solved the underlying problem. The $16,000 Australian annual bottled water spend was one of those fixes. The investigations ongoing in 2020 were part of the same pattern. None of it was a durable solution. The durable solution arrived a decade after the problem was first being actively managed. Ask the people who lived in Pioneer during those years what it meant practically, and the answers are specific. Not using the tap for drinking, keeping a supply of bottled water, thinking about whether young children in the house had been exposed, wondering whether the authority was going to find a real fix or run another temporary measure. The landscape doesn't tell you any of this. Pioneer looks like an ordinary, quiet Tasmanian rural community from the road. The water problem lived inside the houses, in the pipes, in the financial and psychological burden carried by 79 people for a decade. And it cost more to manage improperly than it would have to address directly. This is the entry that changes the nature of the entire list. Every town so far has had a serious, documented, institutionally confirmed water quality failure. But Laramba, Northern Territory, has something none of the others have. Uranium in the drinking water at 0.055 milligrams per litre in a community of 222 people, where residents had to take the government to court to force action, and the government fought them. The Northern Territory, 2024, Court of Appeal records. Uranium is a radioactive heavy metal. Its presence in drinking water carries documented concerns for kidney toxicity at elevated concentrations. Uranium's chemical toxicity is actually the primary health concern at environmental exposure levels ahead of its radioactivity. The Australian Drinking Water Guideline for uranium is 0.02 milligrams per litre. Laramba's water was testing at 0.055 milligrams per litre. That's approximately 2.75 times the Australian guideline. Not slightly above, not at the margin, nearly triple the value that Australian health authorities have determined represents the upper acceptable limit for uranium in drinking water. Laramba is a remote Aboriginal community in the Northern Territory, sitting in the Anmajerry country west of Alice Springs. The landscape is quintessential Central Australian desert. Red earth, spinifex, ancient rocky ranges, the spatial openness of country where the horizon sits very far away in every direction. The community has existed in its current organised form since the mid-20th century, and the 222 residents, according to NT government Bushtel data, are Anmajeri people with deep ancestral connection to country that extends far beyond the boundaries of the town itself. A water treatment plant opened in Laramba in April 2023. ABC News reported the opening, noting that residents could now feel safe drinking tap water for the first time after uranium readings had reached 0.055 milligrams per litre. That's the technical resolution, but the legal story was still unfolding. Because the residents of Laramba hadn't waited passively for the system to fix itself, they had taken the Northern Territory government to court, a clean water legal case that became one of the most significant water rights proceedings in recent Australian history for a remote Indigenous community. In December 2024, the Northern Territory Court of Appeal issued its judgment. The NT government had appealed the residents' clean water ruling. The Court of Appeal rejected that appeal. Let that sit for a moment. The government of the Northern Territory, having presided over a community where drinking water tested at 2.75 times the uranium guideline for years, went to the Court of Appeal to fight the legal consequences of that failure. The court rejected the appeal. The government lost. And as of ABC News reporting in March 2026, litigation proceedings in the Laramba water case were still active. The litigation dimension makes Laramba categorically different from every other entry in this list. In Walgett, the failure was documented and eventually resolved through infrastructure changes. In Uralla, the council issued a clear notice and lifted the alert when levels fell. In Pioneer, Taswater managed the problem badly, but didn't litigate against residents asserting their right to safe water. Laramba's residents had to engage lawyers, pursue a court case, survive the government's appeal of their victory, and continue navigating proceedings into 2026. This is what fighting for clean drinking water looks like when the system decides to fight back. Laramba sits at the end of this list because it is, by every measurable dimension, the most extreme case documented here. The contaminant is a radioactive heavy metal at 2.75 times the guideline. The community had to litigate in court to force action. The government appealed the ruling and lost. The proceedings were still active in 2026. 222 people in the desert west of Alice Springs, drinking water with uranium at nearly triple the safe limit, for years, while the system moved at the pace it chose to move. Residents of Laramba didn't have a local crossing their arms and saying, "Don't drink that," in a quiet warning. They had lawyers, court filings, and a government fighting them in the Court of Appeal. And they won. That's the most damning fact in this entire video. The drawback of Laramba is that the extreme remoteness of Central Australian communities creates genuine infrastructure challenges that have no easy or cheap solution. Uranium in groundwater in this geology is not unusual, and treating it at small community scale is technically demanding. These are real constraints, not excuses. But the existence of the treatment plant, commissioned in 2023, proves that the solution was achievable. The question the litigation was asking, and which the Court of Appeal answered in the residents' favour, is why it took so long, and what the legal responsibility is for the years it didn't happen. Those questions are still working through the system. In 2026, they haven't fully resolved. Sodium, arsenic, discoloured water, uranium, lead, nitrate. 6 different contaminants, 10 documented towns. One country that expects you to believe this kind of thing doesn't happen here. The question isn't whether these towns had water problems. The documented evidence makes that unarguable. The question is what you think it means that the standard response, for years, in some cases for decades, was to manage the failure rather than fix it. Which of these 10 towns would you have been least willing to stay quiet about, and why? Leave it in the comments. And if this kind of documented, source-cited reporting